So hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel on political ecologies of COVID-19. We're absolutely delighted to have all of you here. So a bit about the panel. Amber and I had a discussion a few months back about political ecology and COVID-19 and how it would be really exciting to have a discussion on this at the Pollen Workshop, in part because of the impacts of COVID-19 being so profound. And we thought, and I think probably all of you agree with us, that political ecology has a lot to say about COVID-19. And so we were really interested in what folks were thinking about political ecology as a conversation, a discipline, and what it can tell us about COVID-19, including its emergence, the routes through which it's traveled, its impacts, both at a material level and very much in terms of how these are framed, and thinking about relationships of power across scale, because this very much helps us understand political ecology. But we were also interested in thinking about the limits of political ecology. And I have to admit here that Amber is way more forward-thinking than I am about the limits of political ecology and really pushing up against those. And so that really shaped us in terms of the what we were thinking of, what sort of papers to include here. And so what you'll see among the panelists is a really stellar lineup here of panelists whose work looks at different aspects of COVID-19. We looking at different geographical locations, different topics, and so forth, and really thinking about work that is pushing up against the limits of political ecology. So we're trying to sort of be a bit agenda setting here and pushing political ecology in new directions as well. Okay, so in terms of the structure, each panelist will have about 9 or 10 minutes to speak. And we've asked them to talk about their research, but not just about their research, but also to think a bit in more of an agenda-setting way about political ecology and what it can tell us about COVID-19 and pushing those limits again. And so we'll let each panelist go without Q&A after each individual panelist. We're going to hold all Q&A till the end. Amber's going to moderate the Q&A session, so please, everyone, send in your questions and comments. We're really excited for those. And we're scheduled to end at 6 p.m. BST, and so I think we have plenty of time, even though we got started a little bit late. Okay, so on that, everyone wish me luck as I try to switch things over to our first panelist, and that is Melissa Leach. And I will say, once you're done with your talk, try to give presenting privileges back to me, and I will introduce the next panelist. Okay, so I'm going to make Melissa a presenter.
So, COVID-19 is spreading globally still. But what I want to do is reflect back to the assumed origins of the pandemic, and indeed some other epidemics that I've worked on, like the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, and what they suggest about relations between human and non-human natures and political ecology. So the vast majority of new human diseases have come from wild animals, whether we're talking about HIV, H5N1, H1N1, Nipah virus, Ebola. COVID-19 has turned out in many respects to be the long-awaited big one, but there will certainly be more. And these so-called zoonotic spillover events occur all the time in nature, but they don't usually result in major disease outbreaks. It's only under certain circumstances that a new disease gets noticed, and it's usually those dramatic outbreaks that affect large populations, especially in rich countries and centers of power, that tend to drive global health policies and attention. Ebola followed the classic outbreak narrative of a virus out of a resource-poor place, out of Africa to threaten the world, and COVID-19 has in many ways reversed that direction. We simply don't know how long SARS-CoV-2, the virus, was present in China before it was recognized as a novel disease-causing virus. And there are plenty of just so stories, of course, that point fingers of blame to particular sources. These, though, are largely tentative. They're often misleading, as they have been for many epidemics, and they're easily politicized. So for COVID, the so-called wet markets of urban China have been highlighted as the most likely ground zero. In the avian flu outbreak, it was small-scale poultry farmers. For Ebola in West Africa, it was people interacting with bats in forests. The reflex public health response and global response is often to close down, close markets, close farms, close trade, close forest use. Yet, as we've so often seen, the results can often be ineffective in public health terms and damaging to the lives and livelihoods of small-scale farmers, traders, forest users. So, a political ecological approach to understanding and responding to zoonotic diseases is essential. And this has to recognise both the complex and highly uncertain dynamics through which humans, animals, and unruly ecologies interrelate. But it must also recognise the structural political economic conditions which shape the likelihood of such so-called spillovers, and indeed influence whether such spillover events become epidemics. So let's think about the structural conditions, and here we've got plenty now of analyses and indeed agencies and science policy discourses which talk about the effects of intensive livestock production, encroachment on wildlife habitats, livestock-wildlife interactions as drivers of zoonotic disease, sometimes amplified by wider environmental changes and their structural causes, whether climate change, biodiversity loss, settlement patterns, displacement, or sheer population growth. This quote from the WHO and Convention for Biodiversity shows how, in a way, health and environmental agencies are getting together around these narratives. But we must beware oversimplistic, linear, and often quite neo-Malthusian narratives here, because very often diseases actually don't emerge through a single event, the ground zero of the epidemiological imagination, but through a far wider set of intersecting structural processes over much broader temporal and spatial scales. And it's here that the interactions of politics, of social relations, and of dynamic ecologies become central. These are things that political ecology has been good at looking at, and we need to look at them to understand how epidemics spread and unfold, as well as who gets sick and why. So, for instance, while zoonotic disease spillover likelihood may indeed be linked to increases in farmers' markets with multiple wildlife interactions in close proximity and unsanitary conditions, the so-called Wuhan story, we must ask how it is that such conditions emerge. What are the politics of regulation in such places? Who makes use of such markets? How are animals hunted and captured? For whom? And so on. Wild resources have, of course, long been harvested and been central to diets around the world and indeed traded. And treating wet markets as a smoking gun for zoonotic spillover can often obscure these real drivers and leave them unaddressed. Political ecology has been good at looking at that. Ebola in 2013 was, as I said, traced to the patient zero of an interaction with forests, a small boy supposedly playing by a fallen tree in the village of Meliandu, coming into contact with a bat, the supposed consequence of decades of forest destruction which had brought people and viral forests into contact, yet overlooking villagers' own lived histories of landscape enrichment and anthropogenic forest islands, the lack of vegetation change over the last few decades, and indeed people's own long-lived close interactions with bats, and indeed their own, perhaps more plausible narratives that the Ebola outbreak actually started from human transmission by a woman visitor from Sierra Leone's mining district. Enough of that and more another day. But what I think stories and alternatives like this suggest is that our political ecology needs to go further. It needs very much to address the politics of knowledge and representation, including of human and non-human natures and their implications. So here, let's step back just a little bit, and we find the zoonotic origins of COVID-19 encapsulating big ideas about nature and humanity and how they interact. We see COVID in recent discussions seen as the consequences of human disruption to order in nature. And so disrupted, nature bites back. The pandemic thus becomes a revenge by nature for our invasive growing populations and industrialized systems, impinging on these pure, once untrammeled, virus-animal habitat ecologies. The trope of nature's revenge, as we see here, is often accompanied by another trope, that of nature's resurgence, the so-called anthropause, in which the ravages of the Anthropocene are briefly, perhaps temporarily, halted, evidenced in clear skies, in lack of pollution, in recolonizing wildlife, as in this article from Science. Nice as this is, one might think, we need to ask how long it will last. But more fundamentally, what are the broader meanings and implications of these representations, and what do they exclude? Tropes of balance in nature are nothing new. And as Lorraine Daston has recently written in a philosophical tract, Against Nature, balance in nature has almost always, in many societies, many times and many scales, provided a model for order in human society, a source of norms for human behaviour and for moral reasoning. Indeed, it's because of this that nature's orders provide a model for normativity in humanity generally, that its disruption, apparently threatening and presaging a descent into chaos, is so easy to evoke passion and horror and indeed terror. And in our current era, of course, the tropes of balance and order in nature have gone global, as in the idea of the Anthropocene itself, notions of scientific and policy discourse around planetary boundaries and planetary health, which invoke images of re-steering societal change and the moral imperative to do that within acceptable natural limits to avoid further disruption, and indeed the idea of a global pandemic as absolutely doing that. Yet, as ever, the use of these tropes of order are profoundly political, as imagery of natural orders disrupted are deployed by agencies, by governments, by activists indeed, to support diverse purposes and claims. And in the case of COVID, this imagery of things out of balance is subliminally, I would suggest, fueling international agencies and governments in their emergency response plans and lockdowns, sometimes serving other political aims in controlling populations. While COVID-19 has also spurred environmental and conservation agencies in the latest round of calls for a New Deal to address, as WWF puts it, the urgent need to fix our unbalanced relationship with nature. Deals that, if past experience is anything to go by, could so easily support state and commercial interests in green grabbing wildlife habitats, sometimes disrupting the very rights and ownership that is so important to Indigenous peoples and groups. Yet, and to move on towards some conclusions, there are, of course, look back to the beginning of this talk, some quite fundamental problems with these appeals to nature's order. They encounter difficulties. One problem is the nature of nature, because of course nature never is just nature. It's always shaped by entanglements of processes that involve human action. Put another way, natures are socio-natures. They're constructed through pathways that intertwine the human and the animal practices in very diverse ways. Secondly, these socio-natures are unruly. They're dynamic. They change over time in non-linear ways, which render them disorderly. So if natures are socio-natures and unruliness rules, where does this leave natural orders as a baseline for human normativity? Where does it leave these arguments about nature disrupted or nature resurgent? Certainly it sharpens their represented and political quality. So, third, the boundaries between human and non-human natures are never quite so clear. They're always more negotiable. One doesn't need to go as far as the Amerindian world described by anthropologist Viveros de Castro, where jaguars have human origins and forms, to get this. Our sense of ourselves, of appropriate behaviour, is always and intimately entangled with our lived landscapes, the animals and plants we encounter and nurture. We have social relations with the insects we respect or fear, our pet cats, even our gut flora, and even, dare I say it, our viruses. All aspects of non-human natures which impinge within our bodies. And communication of these non-human and human entanglements are emerging fields of study. And I think political ecology needs these. So, in conclusion, a political ecology of zoonoses does need important attention to the socio-natural shaping and mutuality that characterizes relations between human and non-human natures. It needs attention to the unruliness and disorder that often pervade these, as well as to the power-laden processes through which certain versions of these complex assemblages get deployed and used. And this offers the prospects of enriching political ecology with perspectives from other fields, including philosophy, including history, and including anthropology. It draws us also to alternative perspectives from non-Western and indigenous settings. In my example, Kissi people living with bats in Guinea, respectful relations between hunters and animals, and even perhaps the mutuality of our relationships with viruses. Maybe it reminds us all of our socio-natural status and our mutual entwining in diverse and intimate relationships, invoking perhaps a greater ethics of care and respect. And maybe the true message of the so-called anthropause is not a disruption disrupted, but a reminder of this mutuality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Melissa. That was fantastic, and really what a great way to begin the conversation. And so on that, I think there's going to be some really interesting parallels here. I want to turn things over to Tish Lopez. So let me go ahead and make her the presenter.
Hello. Thank you so much, Libby and Amber, for putting this together, and for everybody for getting us sort of prepped today. And I know that's stressful making this huge move, so I really appreciate everything that everyone's done. So I'm working on this project with Abigail Neely, who unfortunately is not able to be here at the moment because she's teaching. Sort of in pandemic time, everything has gotten a little bit messy, so I just wanted to sort of foreground her apologies for that. So COVID-19 is the fifth coronavirus to emerge in human populations in the past 2 decades, and it's the most virulent of the community-spread HCOVs. And while COVID-19 has disrupted social life, leading to multiple crises, biomedical, economic, social, and political, it has disproportionately impacted low-income and Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities in the US. Much of the essential labor and the non-essential public-facing labors in the US are performed by low-income workers who are disproportionately Black, Indigenous, people of color, women, and immigrants. They often perform this labor without appropriate protective equipment, and all while contending with a small but vociferous minority of people who refuse to comply with disease mitigation guidelines. At the same time, the disease itself bears down on the bodies of Black, Indigenous, and people of color much more heavily, leading to greater morbidity and mortality than whites. This double burden, the outsized impacts on the social and economic lives through heightened exposures, and the greater morbidity and mortality that Black, Indigenous, and people of color experience than whites, is not an accident of the disease. Rather, they have been co-produced by the long histories of structural racism and racial capitalism in the United States, beginning with settler colonialism and slavery and continuing through its many transformations from Jim Crow to the contemporary undocumented labor force. In this very short talk, what Abby Neely and I are trying to do is bring critical political ecologies of health and disease together with racial capitalism in order to interrogate both the racialization of the disease itself and the ways in which racial capitalism has fostered this disproportionate burden among Black, Indigenous, and people of color. In doing this, we are responding to Laura Bliro's caution that, quote, most of us examine racial outcomes without considering racial production, and focusing on a particular racial or ethnic group rather than racial capitalism per se, may lead to improved conditions for some, but it overlooks capitalism's incessant need to actively produce difference somewhere. Political ecologies of health have brought the focus of health and disease out of the sole purview of biomedical processes of the body to encompass what Madison Barber and Julie Guthman call the external political and structural conditions that make certain populations vulnerable to disease. And as Brian King outlines, political ecology further assists in showing how health is situated within political, economic, cultural, and environmental systems that intersect to shape the spread of disease and decision-making options available to human populations. Indeed, a critical political ecology of health and disease necessarily not only moves beyond the biomedical constructions of disease, but also takes seriously, as Jana Lafferty puts it, the histories that produce inequality in resource access and wealth and the construction of racial difference. Which is to say that individual bodies are entangled with the social and political bodies produced in and productive of environments, socio-political processes, and racial capitalism, and must be understood as such. In drawing on racial capitalism, we are centering the differential illness and death of Black, Indigenous, and people of color due to COVID-19 within longer histories of capital accumulation. Theorists of racial capitalism have long argued that capitalist accumulation from its inception has been dependent upon the vulnerability and disposability of racialized bodies. Indeed, racism is a structuring logic of capitalism. In highlighting the impacts of racial capitalism in relation to COVID-19, we are pushing back against the tendencies within biomedicine to search for clues for differential health and disease among racialized subjects in, for instance, genes or even epigenetics, a practice that scholars like Dorothy Roberts, Alondra Nelson, Becky Mansfield, and Julie Gussman, just to name a few, have shown simply reifies the social construction of racial difference. We are also at the same time pushing back against the pathologization of individuals' habits as moral failures, as when U.S. Surgeon General Jerome Robbins invoked, quote, Big Mama and Abuela in his calls to Black and Latinx people to reduce smoking, drug use, and drinking, despite the fact that whites engage in these activities at levels equal to or greater than people of color. Rather, what we are concerned here with is what Arlene Geronimus and others have called weathering, or the cumulative effects of inequality and racism on the health of African Americans specifically, and on people of color generally. On a physiological level, Geronimus and her co-authors tell us, persistent, high-effort coping with acute and chronic stressors can have a profound effect on health. The stress inherent in living in a race-conscious society that stigmatizes and disadvantages Black, Indigenous people of color may cause disproportionate physiological deterioration, marking their biological age as far older than their chronological age. Which is to say that the high prevalence of the very comorbidities that make COVID-19 infection far more severe and more likely to kill, particularly the metabolic conditions such as cardiovascular disease, overweight or obesity, type 2 diabetes, and hypertension among Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the US, are not simply the outcomes of biomedical materiality, but what Shepard Hughes and Locke call the dimensions of human distress, or the social relations of sickness. The weather, Christina Sharp insists, transforms Black being. To weather structural racism, the productive powers of racial capitalism, is to contend with what Christina Sharp calls the weather in which anti-Blackness is pervasive as climate. The weather necessitates changeability and improvisation. It is the atmospheric condition of time and place, and it produces new ecologies. These new ecologies are produced by racial capitalism. Materially, we can see the ways in which racial capitalism is fundamental to ecologies of resource extraction, processing, and disposal. In the US, race is the most significant predictor of a person living near contaminated air, water, or soil, and people of color constitute 56% of the population living near toxic waste sites. Communities of color are more likely to be exposed to nitrogen dioxide air pollutants, and while exposure to any air pollution lowers our ability to fight off infections and worsens reactions to viruses in people with health issues, a recent study found that nitrogen dioxide pollution specifically may be one of the most important contributors to fatality caused by COVID-19. It's not enough then to assert that disease vulnerability is connected to environmental factors and is demonstrated by the concept of environmental justice that can be tied to race, ethnicity, class, and other social categories that experience differential exposure to unhealthy conditions. But we must stretch our thinking toward an engagement with racial capitalism in order to, as Polito asserts, focus greater attention to the essential processes that shaped the modern world, such as colonization, primitive accumulation, slavery, and imperialism. By insisting that we are still living with the legacy of these processes, racial capitalism requires that we place contemporary forms of racial inequality in a materialist, ideological, and historical framework, and that we begin from the stance that racial capitalism produces this differential exposure. So as we move to think through racial capitalism's role in the political ecology of COVID-19, our attention turns to a social ontology of relationality. If this disease has done nothing else, it has highlighted the ways in which we are all interconnected. Our collective ability to survive this pandemic is dependent upon the healthcare workers who care for the sick, the essential workers who keep the shelves stocked, our packages arriving, and our foodways moving, and upon all of us to take seriously mitigation protocols. My health is dependent on your willingness and ability to wear a mask, keep your distance, wash your hands, just as yours is dependent upon the same for me. And yet at root of racial capitalism is, as Jody Melamed tells us, a technology of anti-relationality, a technology for reducing collective life to the relations that sustain capitalism. It insists upon the production of differential values, a kind of differentiation through negation. As we enter the 118th day, it's morning here, consecutive day of protests in the United States, protests for the mattering of Black lives, protests for the freedom to breathe, protests against the ontological negation that racial capitalism produces, I am reminded of Frantz Fanon's words when he said, "We revolt simply because for a variety of reasons we can no longer breathe." In June, more than 1,200 public health experts signed an open letter declaring that racism is a public health and that to protest in the midst of a pandemic that literally takes your breath away for the right to breathe free is to, in the words of Christina Sharp, aspire to do wake work as a mode of inhabiting and rupturing this episteme with our known, lived, and unimaginable lives. Okay, so my turn to figure this out. Pass the ball back to Libby.
Okay, thank you. That was fantastic. I really appreciate that. What we're going to do now, I just wanted to remind everyone to please send your questions in the chat function there, and we'll keep track of those. And I'm going to turn this over to Jonathan Thurston, who will be our next presenter.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Libby. So my talk is called The New AIDS Epidemic. On January 7th, 2015, I walked into a health clinic for an STD test result. A nurse came in, left the door to the room open, stood in the doorway, looked at a clipboard and said, "Hello, Mr. Thurston, you tested positive for HIV. Is there anything else we can do for you today?" Just those two sentences, and they completely changed my life. For whatever reason, I wasn't treated humanely by this clinic, obviously. I wasn't connected to any mental health resources. I wasn't even told where I should go for medication. I wasn't told that there was medication. When I heard those sentences, the first and only question in my mind was, how much longer do I have left to live? Over months of my own internet research and my own groundwork in getting connected to resources, I got the care I needed. But obviously, that care and the systems that provide that care have limits. So my name is Johnny Thurston, they, them pronouns. I am a PhD candidate in English over at Michigan State University, and that generally means my approach to political ecology is fairly different from probably what many of you are used to, because I'm coming from humanities. I often focus on animal studies and race intersections in early modern British literature. However, my scholarly work often diverges into my activist work. So yes, I have HIV. I am what is called undetectable. This means that I am on medication, 1 pill a day, and it effectively does two things for me. First, it stops me from experiencing any symptoms. My life expectancy is the exact same as any one of you. No added chills, bumps, no added pains, nothing extra. Second, I can't spread it. Someone could suck my blood and still couldn't contract HIV. I could have unprotected sex and my partner would not catch it. The real problems that I experience personally around HIV are things like the medical insurance and costs, the treatment by medical care workers, and people at least once a week messaging me online telling me to kill myself because of my HIV status. So as you can probably tell already, a major part of my scholarly framework focuses on melding the critical, the personal, and the political. Earlier this year, on March 17th, Politico Europe called COVID-19 the new AIDS epidemic. Just 2 days ago, MedPage Today released an article called COVID and AIDS, the past is present. And as someone living with HIV in the 21st century, I can't help but notice the ways that COVID specifically has affected my life in unique ways. The availability of my own medicine has changed. People assume I have a significantly greater risk of catching COVID. And news organizations and the occasionally opinionated Facebook friends, they all enjoy calling COVID the new AIDS. So I want to briefly explore how a political ecology lens can be useful in examining this overlap of COVID and HIV. I'm obviously not going to get into too much depth here, but I definitely want to show the concerns at stake with this framework in this context and the ways that this could be productive for a much deeper study. So the political ecology of disease, as Brian King notes in The States of Disease, has had two waves generally. The first, advanced by Jonathan Mayer with his article, The Political Ecology of Disease as One New Focus for Medical Geography, advocated for this political ecology of disease approach, demonstrating how large-scale social, economic, and political influences help to shape the structures and events of local areas. And a second wave emerged from this, tending to approach health in broader terms, addressing it less as the absence of disease and more in terms of long-term well-being and individual agency. One defining feature of this work is the commitment to examining conceptions of health and environment and how they are connected with socioeconomic class, race, gender, and ethnicity. This framework is particularly useful in analyzing both COVID and HIV/AIDS, as well as their comparisons. Here in America, there are fairly obvious similarities. My medications cost about $4,000 a month. And insurance doesn't cover that because in America, HIV is considered a pre-existing condition for whatever reason. So not everyone, especially in marginalized, impoverished, and people of color communities, not everyone's able to get access to these medications, period. The pharmaceutical company who is most working on planning for the COVID treatments here, Gilead, has already announced its costs will be similar to HIV medications and will not be covered by most basic insurances. And if you can believe it or not, my medication is also produced and manufactured and sold by Gilead. So same issues there. So because of this, many people who show symptoms of COVID are already not communicating that to employers for fear of losing their job since they can't afford a test, much less a cure later. This already echoes so much of what has happened and is happening with HIV. King speaks to this in fairly general terms, speaking of the, quote, numerous ways that disease disrupts social and ecological systems. Human diseases remove family members and strain social relationships that are critical to community survival, while also destabilizing economies, ecosystems, and agricultural productivity. The loss of a family member eliminates parents from caregiving duties, thus transferring the responsibility to young adults or elderly family members. Household incomes are reduced, which places greater pressure on children to seek employment rather than attend school. This has so many long-term effects for families and societies that continue for decades after the death of a family member. And these consequences have mapped pretty consistently on both HIV and COVID so far. As Tanya Taylor says in her study of HIV political ecology in South Africa, quote, structural inequalities in the current political economic crisis contribute to risk and vulnerability. So we are seeing those inequalities at work currently in America with both diseases, where we are already getting media articles asking if COVID could also be a disease that only affects people of color in some extremist platforms, or that people of color are the dominant problem when it comes to the spread of COVID. And this speaks a lot to the racial capitalism Patricia was mentioning as well, capitalism that has mattered throughout the HIV epidemic since its origin. So we're already seeing socioeconomic similarities between the two viruses through this political ecology lens. However, the larger relationships between political organizations and agencies are incredibly different. In the 1980s, the Center for Disease Control, or CDC, was hesitant to talk about sex. The politics of sex at the time dictated the politics of disease control, and it meant an incredibly delayed response in America, a delayed public response. The federal government has consistently treated HIV as, quote, a gay disease, with even recently, 2017, Georgia State Representative Betty Price asking health experts if people with HIV, even if they're undetectable like me, could be placed in concentration camps under quarantine for an indefinite period of time. COVID-19, on the other hand, has revealed entirely unique situations in America when it comes to these similar power struggles. The CDC and NIH, the National Health Institutes, basically, have spoken explicitly about the known risks of COVID-19 and have advised masks, social distancing, and statewide regulations. However, most states have ignored this advice on the whole, and many states are completely open at this point and have no mask guidelines. And rather than the federal government vilifying individuals who contract the disease, as what happened with HIV, the government instead refers to this as the Chinese flu and uses xenophobia as a response mechanism rather than addressing the realities communicated through the CDC and NIH. Keynote notes transgender populations and homosexual men are listed as having a high risk of acquiring HIV. Orphans and other vulnerable children and youths are also identified as an at-risk group. Second, those living in poverty are more likely to have HIV. Meanwhile, COVID does not have much in the way of specific risk groups, according to the CDC, except for people with pre-existing medical conditions and generally weak health, people with generally weak health, particularly the elderly. And yet, obviously, at least in America, no one is really using any gerontophobic language here, like homophobia was used and is still used today to characterize the HIV/AIDS epidemic. So, of course, because of many of these connections, I do find the comparison problematic. Again, leaning on my humanities discipline here. So, comparing COVID to HIV willfully ignores concepts like sex shaming, homophobia, the intentional negligence by the medical community of queer lives, which still goes on today. The political ecology of COVID does have some similarities to that of HIV, absolutely. But this rhetoric of equation that we're seeing, especially in journalism right now, the past is present, and the new AIDS epidemic, this is ultimately a means of erasing queer history, queer lives, queer experiences, and queer losses, which of course has so many larger political and ecological implications. King suggests that HIV is not just a disease of the body, but also of the body politic. COVID is not quite the same in this regard. For queer people, HIV is part of our history. I don't know how old you would guess I am, any one of you, but I can assure you I wasn't around to see the AIDS epidemic in its prime. As a result, older gays frequently tell me that I should quit talking about HIV because it's not as bad as it used to be, that I'm not entitled or allowed my own experiences with stigma and lack of medical resources. And that's kind of the difference I'm seeing. The political ecology of HIV is rooted in not just the body politic, as King says, but the queer body politic is rooted in the body. And despite the differences between the two diseases, if you'll pardon the pun, I'm positive we will fight our way through this newest one. So thank you so much. And I will transfer this over to, if I can get my participants up, back to Libby.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks, Jonathan. That was wonderful. And again, I think like the previous two talks, like really pushing us in new directions and to make connections, to really push our understanding, not just of COVID-19, which is fantastic. Okay, so on that note, I'm going to turn this over to our next panelist, and that's Claudia Puerta Silva. So I will make you a presenter, Claudia.
morning from here in Colombia and good afternoon over there. So I'm going to share our presentation. I'm a professor at the University of Antioquia, and I am presenting on the name of my colleagues and friends from La Guajira that wrote this paper with me. This is an exploration of how political ecology approach to help us to understand the permanent humanitarian crisis in La Guajira, Colombia. It's in the north, it's a peninsula in the north of the country, and it's inhabited by the Wayu people, the indigenous people that have been there for centuries. So, so as I said, the title of our communication said the pandemic aggravates the crisis that were already underway, and to see that we are going to take a travel through a time machine, and we will see different phenomena and dynamics, global and national and local, that have been affecting the socio-environmental relationship that the Wayu people have produced over the centuries, over their time, space, of their experience, and how this affects on the socio-environmental relationship have affected their autonomy and their capacities to cope to different phenomena and changes as the pandemic. So let me go through the time machine. So let's see this. Okay. So the Spaniards came to America in the late 15th century, and as I said, they found a hostile territory and a hostile people in La Guajira, and they couldn't settle through the 17th and 18th century. By that time, the Wayu people were actively participating in global economy in the Caribbean. It was the center of the global economy, and they have really intimate relations with English, Dutch, and French, confronting the Spanish crown also in that Caribbean global economy. And after that, in the beginning of the 19th century, Colombia and Venezuela gained their independence from the Spanish crown and began this configuration of these republics. And within that, the position that the Wayu people have accomplished or put it on by these different laws and different dynamics, economical, political, social, that have excluded them from the how do you say that, from the central government. So I have seen a message that my presentation is not working well. So this is a timeline that shows different events that have configured the position that the Wayu people have today, and that explain in part the different humanitarian crises that have struck them. So by the late 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, officials were seeking for natural resources. It was the first boom of oil exploitation in Venezuela, and in Colombia, after the 70s, that was the biggest energy crisis. They began to see the La Guajira as a rich territory because of the natural resources, particularly the coal mines. So after 1980s, they began building this really big mine. I think it's still one of the biggest mines in the world, a coal mine. It's called El Cerrejón. And since then, the life of the Wayu people has been affected by the pollution and appropriation of water and appropriation of territory and other different negative impacts. So if you can put the next slide, please. So as I said, the Guajira and the Wayuu people actively participated in the global dynamics of capitalism, particularly in its production spaces and processes. And this participation led to internal inequalities and power relations that currently concern territorial jurisdiction and sovereignty and differential access to public and private assistance. Since the 70s, extractivism in La Guajira has as corollary the exclusion of entire indigenous populations from the distribution of wealth, the dispossession of their environmental relationships, the socio-environmental impacts, and finally, a socio-spatial fragmentation. I cannot stop explaining all this, but all those are different manifestations of this historical affectation of different structural dynamics over the life of the Wayuu people. Next, please. So we can read the power relations that are in play in this political ecology of hunger and current humanitarian crisis as two different imaginaries about the territory and about the Wayuu people. On one hand, the natural richness of their territory, and on the other hand, they have been seen as poor people. So the current political ecology of extractivism in La Guajira produces exclusion and dependence on local populations through a twofold process. First, dispossession of the socio-environmental relationships through confinement, limitation, and spatial fragmentation, reduction or elimination of livelihoods, among others, the loss of symbolic, social, and material needs of ethnic reproduction, pollution, water scarcity, increased impacts of climate change, and on the other hand, at the same time that they are dispossessed of their material and social and symbolic means of survival, they gain and their subordination and dependence of state assistance and corporate social responsibility and humanitarian aid is augmenting. Next, please. So this was current undergoing when the pandemic crisis struck in Colombia and in La Guajira. And so the Wayuu people had to lock down without material means for survival. Humanitarian aid was unequally distributed. They have a precarious healthcare system, and that is not intercultural or urban, and it's urban-centered. And there has been an augmentation of undernutrition and violence, and also the transgression of different cultural traditions as the death-related rituals and the traditional medicine, their early alert systems, and other issues that have that are or concern their cultural traditions. Next, please. But as a political ecology show us, there are this is a relation. It's a power relation. So we have different local products. For example, with the stopping of the mining for a time in the confinement of the lockdown period, the environment was getting better, as they say, the Wayuu people, because there was no pollution. The youth could understand the importance of traditional medicine because they didn't have access to Western medicine, and they also began to see how their traditional means, their own capacities, their autochthonous practices and knowledge could help them to cope with this pandemic. Next, please. So we have different local coping strategies. Those pictures are part of different communication strategies that local organizations have been doing. Nature, they say, provided the Wayuu with a warning of this pandemic through dreams and through early alerts. and they have been doing different rituals and activities that help them prevent and heal the disease. And also they have been rained, so they have been cultivating again. So these are different aspects of this this dynamic that I wanted to present. It's very short, and yeah, so it's a very local subject. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Claudia. That was fantastic as well. Next on the roster, we have Jeff Rose. So Jeff, let me pass this over to you.
Great, thanks so much. I really appreciate Libby and Amber for organizing this, and I really appreciate everybody attending and that kind of thing. I'm just trying to get that up and running. Okay, so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about political ecology, and particularly focusing on unsheltered homelessness and the responses during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm going to share a little bit of initial empirical data, but largely frame this around kind of a theoretical argument for thinking about this through the lens of necropolitics, and something that political ecology, I think that's a place where political ecology could engage maybe a little bit more thoroughly in the time coming ahead. So one of the things that I wanted to start with was just this idea, and we've seen this in a couple of the other presentations, that the response, the environmental response to the pandemic is one where we see both decreased carbon emissions on this slide on the left, or the graphic on the left, and then at the same time we also see decreased regulation, at least in a Western or United States context. And one of the things that I want us to think about is what does this say about certainly our nature-society relationships, but really the relationship between nature, state, and capital, and then also how can we take these relationships, these environmental relationships, and think about how they get embodied by people who are the most vulnerable among us. So with that in mind, I want to start out with an understanding of homelessness. Homelessness has long been understood from an ecological standpoint, and that is that we have these intimate daily relationships, people who are facing homelessness, with the non-human natural environment on a daily lived experience basis. And those vulnerabilities are often exacerbated during extreme weather events or extended climate events. And so we see things like devastating natural disasters, and then also kind of the slow burning disaster of climate change, or maybe it's not so slow burning, as at least in the United States, the American West is on fire. And so homelessness is largely is beginning to be conceptualized as an ecological understanding, a human nature interaction like that. And one of the things that we can think about is that it's this embodied experience, and this is a quote here: the fundamental physical circumstances, exposure to the elements, the struggle to keep clean, the discomfort of bedding down on concrete, that are often the most piercing. And one of the things that political ecology is doing is starting to think about this as a political ecology of homelessness, not just an ecology of homelessness. And so here's where we see local articulations of homelessness are necessarily tied in to these nested scales of much more larger globalized political economic conditions and trends, things like housing markets, mental health care, unemployment, local laws and ordinances, and things like that. And then ultimately, one of the things that we're beginning to understand is that things like health and cleanliness in a political ecology lens are actually leveraged against people who are facing homelessness and are used as a rationale for displacement, for further marginalization, and for the material depletion of their lives. So one way that we can think about this, and one way that political ecologists have thought about this, is through the notion of metabolism. And this kind of a fundamental understanding of homelessness is that homelessness relies upon public space. Public space is where social relations, physical relations, and metabolic relations happen on a daily basis. And homelessness is necessarily criminalized, right? The very act, the very definition of homelessness places one in a liminal situation of criminality. Metabolism, as it's often understood in kind of a natural science standpoint or otherwise, often refers to these kind of material biophysical interactions. So we can think about the disposing of waste, eating, breathing. What are those kind of material things that happen on a daily basis? And then metabolism is also used from a much more critical standpoint in the context of capitalist relations. And, Marx talked about the first and second contradiction of capitalism, where capitalism tends to undermine both its economic preconditions for its existence and its environmental preconditions for its existence. And these, and the way that Marx understood this is that material and social systems are not necessarily separate, but they metabolize together. And this metabolic process is one that we've tended to see social relations as being separate from materialist natural relations, as Marx might call it, but it's the process of capitalism that separates those things as much as anything. And so this metabolic series of relations between labor and nature constitute the actual capitalist mode of production. And then this is a lot of John Bellamy Foster's work talking about the metabolic rift, or what we see as this kind of separation between the interdependent processes of social metabolism. What does social metabolism have to do with homelessness and its existence in kind of an urban political ecology sphere? There's following the right to the city movements, which is David Harvey, Don Mitchell, building off Lopez, have built off the right to the city, which is basically saying that we need to democratically re-envision what we mean by the urban. That's been transferred by some political ecologists, Nick Heine, Maria Kaika, Aaron Swingadow, where they have ultimately established what we need to start thinking of as a right to metabolism. And this is the idea that we in the urban environment have a right to engage in these social metabolic relations with the non-human natural world around us. And those things are particularly in tension in contemporary urban spaces, but they're in tension across the urban wildland interface as well. So what does the right to metabolism look like in the idea of unsheltered homelessness? So when people are living in the outdoors, when people are living in unsheltered homelessness, they are making biopolitical claims, rights to life, rights to space, and right to basic metabolic functioning, the right to eat, sleep, excrete waste, breathe, expel. Like these kinds of very kind of fundamental human existences now get played out in the public realm and get played out in the urban public realm. This is built off of a kind of Foucauldian notion, or Jeremy Waldron mentioned this, that rights do not exist without a space in which for those rights to be enacted. And so if they don't have a space where they can be uncriminalized, where do people go through these basic metabolic rights? Where do they eat? Where do they sleep? Where do they expel waste during the day? And ultimately, these struggles for public space, right, these struggles to have a space in which to enact these metabolic rights, the right to metabolism, is a struggle for life itself from a biopolitics standpoint. So what does this look like in this time of coronavirus, in the time of global pandemic? It's been established that people who are facing unsheltered homelessness have an increased potential exposure to COVID-19, and then an increased susceptibility once they get COVID-19. I'm going to just read a direct quote here. If exposed, people experiencing homelessness are more susceptible to illness or death due to the prevalence of underlying physical and mental medical conditions and the lack of reliable and affordable health care. And of course, this is in a U.S. context, which may be different from healthcare systems in other parts of the world. So we've started a little bit of research into this, and we've started conducting interviews with people who are facing unsheltered homelessness here in Salt Lake City, Utah, and then also in Phoenix, Arizona, where both cities have high incidence of unsheltered homelessness in their downtown cores. And with these semi-structured interviews, we've been able to talk to people on site in encampments, in sleeping setups, in kind of urban public space, urban public sphere, so on and so forth. And I wanted to share this quote with the panel and with the audience. And this was a young man, a 32-year-old man, and he said, "It's bad, but it was bad before, you know. We had no problems right away." He was talking about in March with the onset, because they were dealing with other things. But then they come in here and they tell us we got to clean up, we got to do this and that. The health department says that, the cops threatening, and they're the ones who bring the bug in here. We were clean, we were keeping to ourselves. I'm not going to a homeless resource center, because that's where you get the bug, and they want to bring us into that. And so I think that's a really telling quote, because it gives us a few different insights into this process. One, it makes a claim for self-sufficiency. It makes a claim that their right to metabolism was being exercised in the initial stages of the pandemic, largely because they were outside of an institutional structure of the health department, the law enforcement structures, and the homeless sheltering complex. Then it moves into a place where they see those same institutions as being threatening. And the institutions that are designed to bring health, stability, lawfulness, things like that, actually have this perverse inverse effect of providing almost the exact opposite of that. And then the perception is that bringing folks into the management of the homeless industrial complex is actually where you might be a greater existence or a greater exposure to coronavirus and ultimately to COVID-19. And so our analyses, this quote and many other from these initial interviews, I think present a little bit of a chronological standpoint that's helpful to think about here. So, initially, people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness felt ignored. And then there was limited outreach or camp improvements, even though the National Alliance to End Homelessness, the CDC, recommended that unsheltered encampments be fitted with sanitation settings, with hand washing stations, with antibacterial hand sanitizer, be fitted with restroom facilities. But there was none of that according to our initial research here. And then the other thing that I think is particularly interesting is a number of our respondents indicate that there was a protest response related displacement. And so both Phoenix and Salt Lake City faced a number of protests following the George Floyd murder. And it wasn't so much the protests themselves, but it was the response of the lockdown of those cities by mayors and by counties that actually served as a displacement vector for people who are facing unsheltered homelessness. And so, again, kind of building off of some of the other previous research, Patricia Lopez's and Abby McNeely's, in terms of this kind of interesting intersection of the pandemic and people of color who are feeling threatened and are, materially threatened, and then how people who are facing unsheltered homelessness sit at the intersection of that. Consistent with other research, there's a hostility and a seemingly unviability of homeless resource shelters, and then there's also the idea of fearing seasonal change. So as our seasons change and as things get colder, and what does enforcement look like? What does it look like to be entering into some of these spaces? Things like that. Okay, so I want to introduce this notion of necropolitics, which is often contrasted with Foucault's notion of biopolitics. And Foucault mentioned in Society Must Be Defended that the power to make live and let die is the power of biopolitics. And then necropolitics was advanced by Mbembe, who basically says that Foucault's biopolitics didn't account for new and expansive forms of subjugation and violence, and that this is the power of death. So what does the power of death look like for people who are facing unsheltered homelessness? Within those communities, experiencing necropolitical structural violence. Violence stems from inaction and abandonment by state institutions, state-sanctioned institutions. And so people who are facing homelessness are both embodying and managing not only death itself, but the anticipation of death, which has a psychological feature as well. And then from outside, I think, which is helpful to think about, is again going back to this homelessness management institutional complex, and that death is an accepted outcome of COVID-19 management, and that the people who are facing early forms of marginalization or existing forms of marginalization are likely to face continued forms of marginalization. And so this notion of disease operates at multiple levels. It's kind of sitting at this tension between the biological and the metaphorical, and where COVID-19 is on one hand, and homelessness itself is treated as a disease for the body politic on the other hand. So what are some of the implications for political ecology? I think, thinking about homelessness, unsheltered homelessness as a biopolitical process, and then also as a necropolitical process. And then I think the place where this is really productive is where we might think about this in terms of embodiment and corporeality with health and disease, which we've heard a little bit elsewhere. And then how do we think about this in terms of health, bodies, and more than human natures? And so the final comment that I want to make here is just that there might be more radical responses to some of these socio-political and socio-ecological concerns, and those might represent some of the limits of political ecology. And so with that, I thank you. And if I can figure out how to turn it back over, I will do so.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. It seems like I'm the presenter again. And our last panelist I'd like to introduce is Rahul Muraliteron. I will turn this over to you, Rahul.
Hello, everyone. So the research that I'm presenting today is based on the work of several other colleagues from ATRI and their affiliated research organizations. I thank the panel organizers as well as POLLEN for providing us the opportunity to present our work. So I'd like to introduce my presentation with this cartoon just to provide context and a background to the COVID-19 situation in India. In January 2019, when COVID-19 was out of sight, the union budget, the government union budget's plan was to make India a 5 trillion economy by 2024. But when cases were very low, on March 24th, 2020, the Indian Prime Minister announced an intense lockdown within 4 hours of notice. There was no consultation with the state or the parliament, and the country came to a standstill, and the informal sector was severely affected due to the lockdown. And some of you might know the migrant crisis, which is much more visible. Several migrant workers were locked in the cities, and they were trying to get home, and it created a lot of chaos. In the meantime, the ineffective policies and practices meant that regardless of the lockdown, COVID-19 cases began to increase in India. As the economy took a severe hit owing to the lockdown, and the government issued unlock guidelines to open up the economy. So currently, India is right behind US with the second most number of infections. So COVID has created a severe impact on the economy as well as public health, and the government is coming up with autocratic response to rebuild the economy. So, as I mentioned, India is worst hit by COVID among other countries across the world. The last quarter, the GDP declined to minus 23%. In response, the Indian government has come up with a vision of Atmanirbhar Bharat, or Self-Reliant India, which is a nationalistic project that aims to make the economy resilient. This will be done through reducing imports and increase export by the way of boosting the economy. So robust environmental policies are a roadblock for this vision of economic prosperity, and the government has tweaked a range of environmental policies and has opened up seascape and landscapes for investments and extraction, that is moving from protection to deregulation. So we see this as an intensification of pressure, where we draw from Busher and Fletcher, where they use this in the context of green wars, in terms of the intensification of pressure in security and conservation. what we see here is intensification of power and capital, which is adding additional pressures on people and resources. I just want to clarify the fact that the outcomes or the sort of outcomes are not necessarily linked with the self-reliant India vision, but broadly, I'm referring to the state's response to divide the nation's economy from the pandemic impact. So just to give you a broad overview of the range of policies that have been tweaked, for instance, the environmental impact assessment, which is a strong policy, has been tweaked, where there will be no public consultations and clearance will be given for projects of strategic interest, defense, public utilities, and projects of national importance. This is the same with the coastal regulation zone notification that you see on the right corner. These are sort of roadblocks for the development vision the government has. For instance, the Karnataka Land Reforms Act repurposes land that is secured for agricultural purposes for other purposes, including industrialization. The forest policy, new draft policy, ignores the forest rights, and it pushes more centralized control of managing products for the forest for production. And the draft national fisheries policy is the first of the kind, which sort of integrates all types of fisheries, inland fisheries, marine fisheries, capture and culture fisheries together in one policy, and the aim is to increase exports. So there has been a lot of debate since the pandemic began about there are big debates on degrowing the economy or degrowth. So degrowth critiques global capitalism and the urge for growth at all costs, which causes human and environmental damage, and it advocates for less consumption and production for a socially equitable and environmentally just world. But what we argue that rather the pandemic being a portal to alternate economic order, the state is returning to further intensification of accumulation, which is creating necessary conditions to make capital live. As I mentioned earlier, this paper is based on several cases across India, the north, the east, the west, and the south. For this presentation, I will be providing the case of small-scale fisheries in Tamil Nadu. When I say small-scale fisheries, I mean fishing households as opposed to commercial companies using low capital and energy, making short trips close to the shore. So the COVID-19 had severe effects on the small-scale fishing sector due to the disruption of supply chains, and it has shown the vulnerability of small-scale fisheries to market forces. This is the case not just in Tamil Nadu, but across the world. And mobility is the key to fishing and for the seafood trade and the livelihoods of the fishing communities. But the fishing communities have been discriminated as well as stigmatized in COVID response. When I say discrimination, for instance, agriculture or farming was considered as an essential service, but not fisheries. Later, protests by fishers made the government to allow the people to go fishing. And stigmatization, particularly with respect to the post-harvest sector, where women fishers are affected. In Tamil Nadu, in both urban and rural areas, women take fish across streets to sell them. So there was some stigmatization associated with the women, going into the streets and selling the fish. And therefore, apart from the government restrictions, the villages had their own restrictions, because if one person from a fishing community contracts the virus, then the whole community will be stigmatized. So amidst this, the government has also come up with several schemes, and one particular scheme particularly important in fisheries is it has allocated $2.7 billion to double income and export and increase exports or triple exports to about $1 trillion US dollars. So there is heavy investment in fisheries. So what this means is this is further capitalization of fisheries, where by creating more infrastructure such as harbors and cold storage facilities to increase export and augment the production targets. So the national fisheries policy is mainly geared towards increasing exports, and this is planned to be done through deep sea fishing, promoting aquaculture and mariculture. This could be seen as a form, as a blue economy project. So the definition of blue economy is ambiguous and is flexibly used. But for this presentation, I'm defining blue economy as a process of valuing oceans as the next large economic frontier or a source of natural capital. So, quoting Choi, where she mentions that we need to see blue economy not simply as an economic project, but as a specific mechanism of the government in a particular geographical context that rearranges people and resources to extract value. So, in terms of small-scale fisheries, the communities in Tamil Nadu are generally dependent on the nearshore and inshore areas. They have been dependent on these resources for several generations. But research shows that both nearshore and inshore fisheries have been severely depleted. Yet the state does not take into consideration the contribution of the small-scale fisheries sector to employment and food security, and it has neither managed the nearshore resources for the benefit of this population. Rather, it is displacing the problem, and the solution that the state comes up with is deep sea fishing, that is moving farther away from the shore to access resources that are underexploited, and further intensifying culture fisheries through the promotion of aquaculture and mariculture. So these sort of coastal transformations have a potential to impact the environment as well as the fishing communities, and it also is an invitation for private players to enter fisheries, particularly in terms of culture fisheries as a form of aquaculture and mariculture. So just to conclude, we find that the self-reliant India vision of the Indian government that is aimed at exports will increase pressure on ecosystem as well as natural resource dependent communities in India. So this is something that we see across the cases that we have on pastoralism, on compensatory afforestation, on tourism, on agriculture, on coffee production, as well as on conservation. So rather than the pandemic being a portal to new economic order, we see the pandemic seems to be a gateway to autocracy and the intensification of pressure, which will create a long-lasting ecological as well as societal impacts. So with the erosion of environmental safeguards and in efforts to make capital live, some vulnerable humans are let die. And I'm going to come back to the migrant workers that I began with, where during the lockdown, the labor was kept in fragile conditions in cities so that when the economy opens up, they can be used again as a labor to engage in any sort of work that they have been. But they have been locked up in very fragile and severe conditions. And the subsequent unlock guidelines issued by the government has also ensured that COVID virus has spread to rural areas and it's creating a havoc. So this is clear from the current scenario that the infection rate in India is very high, and both the public health systems are struggling to keep the virus under control. Thank you. That's it from me.
Okay, hi everybody. We've received a couple of questions so far. If anybody else has questions for any of the individual presenters or the group as a whole, feel free to enter them into the chat box and make sure that you have send to everyone clicked. But we'll just get started here. If people would like to turn on their video, maybe, that could be a good first step. So I'm going to start with a question that was posed to Melissa Leach. And I think, yeah, others might have something to say about it it was asked by Tejendra. Are you still here, Tejendra?
Hello. Yeah. Yeah. Good evening. Yes. So I was wondering if Melissa came across any kind of study which scientifically argue that and fills a gap between nature and animal interaction or human, that how this pandemic came in picture actually, because we are so much speculating that due to ecological crisis, we are now in such a situation, devastating or catastrophic realm, that but we are not, we don't have any kind of very scientific fact about that it was transferred from the animal to human actually. And we, most of the talk around this pandemic is talk about outcomes of and what are the present conditions basically are coming in picture, but we are not talking about what is the pre-COVID condition led to this. We say that capitalism has led this and different kind of extractive activities has led to this situation, but there is no such direct link. I don't lead to this argument actually. This is my kind of answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a really good question in there. I think Melissa. So can you point to any particular bodies of scientific research that really illustrate linkages between ecological and economic structures, for example, and processes, and the emergence of COVID and other zoonotic diseases?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is a lot of literature, but some of it is actually quite problematic in ways that I was trying to allude to in my presentation. So there is a big environmental and health literature, which overlaps with a sort of policy literature, which makes the argument about often quite linear causal shifts between sort of transmission of viruses between the natural world and people. And this is where you get things like the work of sort of Peter Daszak and the US Aids supported predict and prevent programs. You also get a lot of the work that goes under the banner of planetary health and publications in the Lancet and many other journals over the last period. Some of those then allude to the pre-existing structural conditions which make those spillovers more likely, and they talk about things like population growth and capitalist economies and so on, but they do it in a very glib, very all-encompassing and quite linear way. These things become structural drivers, and what I find is that one needs the insights both of political ecology to look at the politics of those processes, but also the unruliness, the non-linearity, the dynamics in human nature interactions, which mean that actually a lot of this is very much more uncertain. It's not predictable. It's not therefore presentable. It's not modelable as risk in the way that much of the science would have it. And that's where I think some of the other contributions that political ecology has made are far more useful, the more critical takes, the feminist takes, the takes that have looked at experiential worlds and at much more uncertain, much more disorderly processes. And somehow we've got to marry the two together. What I would also just like to say, in case I don't get a chance to come back, is that where I was trying to get to at the end of my talk is to see some really fruitful future directions, actually in things that other people have picked up. So socio-natures, yes, feminist political ecology has done a lot in this area, but it's precisely connecting up those debates with embodiment, with ideas about metabolism, with the work on more than human natures, where I think we had a chance to look at these human, non-human interactions, including those with viruses, which play a merry dance with us, actually. And I think the political ecology of viruses in the body is something we should look at further. And these I see as all quite exciting frontier areas, and they've been picked up very well from slightly different points of view in some of our other presentations.
And some comments made, sharing some resources. So Simon Batterbury shared a link early on to the Political Ecology COVID papers in the Journal of Political Ecology, so you can scroll up on the chat to find those. And Rebecca Witter also mentioned an emerging project that people might be interested in called Ecologies of Harm, Mapping Vulnerability in the Time of COVID-19. And there's also a link to that in the chat if you're interested in checking it out. Let's see. We have a question for Jeff from Libby, who would love to hear more about the links between COVID-19, homelessness, biopolitics, and recent wildfires devastating the West, if you have any reflections on that.
I have some reflections on it. I also have some empirical data. We've just finished up a study looking at people's perceptions and visits to health clinics based off of poor air quality and cardiorespiratory concerns. And that's based here in Salt Lake City, and Salt Lake City gets winter inversions, which is particularly poor low-level, ground-level air quality. And so one of the things is we see a really high incidence among sheltered and unsheltered people. One of the things we were looking for was some sort of difference between sheltered and unsheltered, thinking that there would be a massive difference between those who are able to sleep indoors and those who are sleeping in encampments and on the streets and things like that. And one of the surprising findings was we didn't find much of a difference in terms of reported cardiopulmonary concerns and then visits to health. And so one of the things that made us think about is kind of recenter the notion that homelessness itself, whether sheltered or unsheltered, is a lived experience in the public domain, which is generally out of doors. And so even having some respite in a shelter doesn't necessarily provide for kind of long-term relief from some of those air quality concerns. And so I guess, bringing that into more of a political ecology standpoint, I think, one of the things that we see is, first of all, the necessarily interconnectedness between disparate events. I mean, there's fires burning up and down the West Coast, and apparently it's affecting air quality in New York City and throughout the Midwest. And so, the notion of the Anthropocene and the interconnected nature of all this is as clear as possible. And then also the power hierarchies that are going on there, just like COVID, just like the social unrest. Those who want to insulate themselves from that need to have privileged positions, privileged socioeconomic positions, in order to insulate themselves from some of those things, and largely can do so. And those who are living in the streets, or those who are poor or otherwise, are less able to do so. I could probably talk more about this, but I want to hear some of these other questions and other people speak. So thanks for the question.
So we have another question for Melissa, but I think other panelists might like to weigh in on it, because I say for Melissa because it was asked just after Melissa's talk. Let me find it. Sorry. So this question is, schools of thought based on Indigenous studies, but also feminist political ecology, have for some time now questioned human nature duality. That which the questioner says criticize human nature duality, conceptualizing ourselves for what we are. In other words, a part of nature has a lot of potentials, but also might have some risks. Do you have any reflections or thoughts on human-nature duality and going beyond it?
Okay, that's a big question and a very good question. I think this is really a bit of a frontier area for political ecology, or actually a frontier area in anthropology and philosophy, where I think political ecology has got a lot to say. Conceptualizing ourselves as part of nature, which of course we are, shouldn't undo attention to the detailed interactions which go on within nature. In a sense, it just displaces an anthropocentric focus to a broader focus, but it still requires that we look in detail at those interactions and what they mean. Maybe it brings us some more symmetrical attention to trying to understand the world, not just from the perspective of human beings' interests, but also that of non-human entities within those interactions within nature. I think there's a very fruitful and interesting field which could look at viruses and actually the interactive dance between human bodies and viruses, not conceptualized as an attack, as the metaphor usually goes, but actually the way our own body cells and immune responses make use of viruses, how viruses themselves have agency. I think there's also I think some of the work on human, non-human communication within nature and communication amongst animals and plants is also an area of enormous creativity here. So I think the risks are that we lose the sharpness of our attention to interactions and their politics. I think the benefits are expanding the field of what political ecology can do.
Sorry about that. Would any of the other panelists like to take a stab at that very, very philosophical but really relevant question? Not that philosophy is not relevant.
For me, at least, coming at it from, again, the more humanities aspect, I immediately think of critics like Eli Clare and Donna Haraway, who talk a lot about naturescapes and the ways that that kind of duality mentioned in the original question matters a lot for disease discourse. This idea that we have internal naturescapes, and a virus is not just an internal thing, but also a social virus just as much often. And so we're seeing with things like COVID, and in my case, HIV, these kinds of, sometimes the social aspects can be even more crippling, corruptive, and contagious than the actual internal virus. So negotiating that duality can be very tough, because for the majority without the disease in either case, they see it as a purely biological, purely internal situation, internal virus, not realizing the larger structural issues. So it's tough kind of negotiating even the rhetoric, the media, the stereotyping, all these other elements that weigh into the construction of that naturescape.
Anyone else? Thoughts?
I've been thinking about this along the lines of the racialization of the microbe itself, right? When it first came out, it's the Wuhan virus, it's the China virus, and there's a lot of work that's being done by that, and that created this sort of fear-mongering in the US. And then as Jonathan talked about, the issues around sort of the racial constructs around that, for a while it was believed African Americans could not contract it. And then it was believed to have come from the Jewish people. And then it was used by white supremacists as a weapon. And so what you actually see is spit becomes weaponized through this transferal of the microbe, right? So it's making this move and disallowing us to sort of imagine ourselves as the only gatekeepers of what it means to exist in the world as human or non-human, when we so completely take in this microbe, and it sort of is an embodiment, its own sort of micro-racialization of fears, anxieties, etc. So I think Melissa, thank you for this really well. You know, this sort of frontier work is really trying to, especially if you're thinking about the microbiological and its existence and its relation to sort of nature, society, and undoing that dualism.
I guess maybe I'll just comment on this, that one of the things that comes up when thinking about COVID-19 is there's a politics of scale at play here. And we've heard everything from thinking about it at the microbe level, at this invisible, this thing that infects our bodies in these, you know, invisible ways that becomes manifest. And then, you know, I'm struck by also kind of my daily look at the newspaper and seeing the maps, like these giant nationwide and perhaps even worldwide maps, you know, that are different colors to indicate different levels of threat. And that one of the things that COVID-19 does, maybe more than most things in recent memory, is it complicates this notion of scale. And so this question of, you know, the nature-society dichotomy, it's almost as if that also needs to be addressed at multiple different scales, from the microscopic to the global as well. And there's probably different answers for how to break that apart at different scales.
We've got 7 minutes left. And also a question which is not answerable in 7 minutes, but I'm going to pose it to the panel, and I'm also posing it to all of our attendees as both something to respond to as briefly as you can, but also as food for thought going forward. This question is from Mary Minton. Thank you all of the speakers. In Brazil, indigenous leaders we're working with Speak Against the Failure to Act to Control COVID-19 as a, quote, genocide by omission and part of the politics of extermination against indigenous peoples and other groups in Brazil. What can political ecology say regarding inaction related to COVID as a form of genocide, building on necropolitics as a concept often used, both in terms of indigenous peoples, but more broadly, for example, unsheltered homeless populations? Should we be speaking more about genocide regarding COVID, but also other manifestations, such as land grabbing, mining, et cetera, and why aren't we? So shall we have a round of people maybe just responding briefly, maybe responding with a counter question as a way of kind of finishing off but looking forward?
Can I say something there?
Yeah, go
I
ahead,
think
Claudia.
we can speak about genocide. I think it's a good concept for defining or describing what is happening, but not now, only now with the COVID. Before that, I think even if with people that are have a relationship with nature different from the Western one, in the way that they are part of nature. The thing that is being affected by capitalism and by power relations are the relations that we build with environment. So in that way, it's like we have to have the same relation that capitalism builds with environment. So for indigenous people, even if there are animist or totemies or different kind of relations with the nature, this relation is the one that is affected, not only the material means for living or the material conditions for existence, but that relation. And it's going to be the same that Western global, society has with environment. So I think that's a point there to reflect on more, and not only incorporate humans in nature. And so I just wanted to say that.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody else have a brief comment? I think Melissa seemed to speak.
A brief one. I mean, I think there's a lot of mileage in the use of the literature and concept of necropolitics here. I think we also need to address not just the necropolitics of failure to control COVID, but actually the necropolitics of attempts at control.
Yeah.
And I think it was Rahul's presentation on India that showed very strongly how politicized attempts at control can provide a guise for all kinds of other political acts of commission and omission, licensing other forms of grabs and of autocracy, which can have genocidal consequences. And I think we also need to keep our analysis of social difference in there very strongly. So the presentations today that have talked about vulnerable groups and questions around genocide, not just as linked to particular peoples or indigenous peoples, but actually who is vulnerable and what are the politics of that vulnerability to both the disease and to control measures, I think needs to be kept very much alive.
Thank you. We are just about out of time. Becky, will the room shut down on us when we reach 6 p.m.?
No, it won't. And there aren't any other sessions due. So it's okay to run slightly over as long as the panelists are okay with that and you're okay with that.
Are the panelists okay with running about 5 minutes over to take one more question?
Yeah.
Okay. So sorry, we can't take everybody's question. There's such good ones coming in. Let's see. Okay. Sorry, I'm choosing between two. Okay, this is a question from Alex Shanklin. Related to Mary's question, having heard Brazilian indigenous leaders talk about the Brazilian government as the principal vector of the virus, and Mozambican commentators describe it as a virus that comes, quote, comes from rich white people in Europe, end quote, have panel members encountered other cases of COVID-19 narratives been used to push back against the powerful and disrupt or reverse racialized or colonial hierarchies? This is a great question to end on and maybe go around again. I think a lot of people might have something to say. Anyone like to start? Maybe someone who hasn't spoken much yet.
Yeah, I can go ahead with the question. So when COVID started infecting parts of India, I think the narrative was more about people who can afford to travel, bringing in the virus into the state, or for instance in Tamil Nadu or Chennai. But in a sense, broader narratives were primarily identifying mobile populations or vulnerable communities as a problem. So initially there was a constant clash between who is the carrier of virus, and of course there have been narratives that show that people with money who are able to travel are bringing in the virus. But over time that narrative has subsided, and it's more focused on the poor and the marginalized and the vulnerable population who are being termed as the vectors of virus, and the rich people's narrative is somewhat evaporated.
Anyone else?
Well,
go ahead.
Okay, I could come in here. I mean, there's a kind of narrative that I'm seeing coming out of some of the African settings where I work, including in Sierra Leone, where people are saying COVID is not our disease. Our disease was Ebola, and that this actually is a manufactured epidemic between superpowers, and so calling upon the geopolitical clash between the US and China as a way of reading almost in sorcery-like terms what is going on in the world, and then interpreting it as having crept down as a sort of fallout to affect people in African settings, but nevertheless a degree of denial about how relevant it is going to be, which speaks in some respect also to the limited numbers of deaths that people are seeing in those contexts. So, I mean, that's a more complicated set of narratives. It's not one that's countering power, but it's certainly highly localized interpretations of COVID in terms of global geopolitical conflicts. And I think there's some salience in those narratives.
All right, we're just past 6, so do I have Becky, could you pass it back to Libby so we can just thank everybody together? Or I don't know if we need you. Libby, are you still there?
I'm still here.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess we'll just close by offering a very heartfelt thanks to all the panelists. I know it's really a busy time for everyone and, indeed a very busy time. So thank you for taking the time to put your thoughts together. This is really enlightening. I think it gives us a lot to think about. And also thank you to all of you that joined. We really appreciate your interactions as well. And so maybe I'll leave it to Amber to give the final word. But for me, a very warm thank you.
Thanks, Libby. I think this has just been a great session. Thank you all so much for being here. A lot of things to think about. I'm definitely taking away some thoughts around this idea of intersecting disease ecologies and intersecting kind of like dimensions of power and the ways in which let's just say, we've got embodiment and then re-embodiment and politics. And yeah, so I'm going to be trying to do some synthesis in my own mind, but also think about new questions going forward. Just thank everybody so much. It's been a long day, so have some fun, get some rest, maybe do some virtual coffee time or happy hour, whatever you prefer. And we'll see you back tomorrow, hopefully. Thank you all again so much.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.